So, someone online just told you that because two things happened, one after the other, that the first one must have caused the second one. Or your uncle says that your position on climate change can be dismissed because you're not a scientist. Or maybe a politician claims that we should do something because everyone agrees. Do these feel like good arguments? Do they even seem like arguments at all? Well, to be honest, they're not great. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly why, and you'll never fall for them again. Instead, you'll have a toolkit to evaluate any argument you encounter, online, in conversation, or even in your own head, and spot the difference between reasoning that works and reasoning that just sounds good. Because being able to spot good arguments and avoid bad ones is at the very heart of doing philosophy. G'day, I'm Drew, the philosopher, and last time we talked about what philosophy really is, disciplined thinking about question that matters. But here's the thing, if you're going to think carefully about hard questions, you need to know what good thinking actually looks like. And that means understanding arguments. Not the shouty kind where someone eventually storms off. The other kind, where someone gives you reasons to believe that something is true, you listen to them, and you potentially reconsider your thinking or your prior commitments. So today we're building up your philosophical toolkit with the basics of spotting good arguments and avoiding bad ones. And trust me, once you see this stuff, as I've said, you can't unsee it. You'll start noticing it everywhere, in the news, in YouTube comments, or in the things people casually say to you with startling certainty. So let's get into it. First, what even is an argument? Well, in philosophy, an argument isn't a fight, it's a structure. And usually it's got two parts. It's got premises, and these are your reasons, your evidence, your starting points, and a conclusion, the thing you're trying to convince someone is true, even if that someone is yourself. Here's a simple one. Premise 1, the highest grossing films are the best films. Premise 2, Avengers Endgame is one of the highest grossing films ever made. Conclusion, therefore Avengers Endgame is one of the best films ever made. That's an argument. The premises are supposed to support the conclusion. If they do their job well, you should be convinced. Now here's where it gets interesting. There are two ways to evaluate whether an argument is any good. Well, there's a lot more than that, but let's start with the first fundamental two. Validity and soundness. Validity asks, if your premises were true, would the conclusion logically follow? So let's take a look at another similar argument. Premise 1, all dogs can fly. Premise 2, Spot is a dog. Conclusion, therefore Spot can fly. That's a valid argument. I know, dogs can't fly. But if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true too. The logic works. It's valid. But you may have spotted that there's something wrong with the last two arguments we've looked at. That's because they're not sound. Because soundness requires two things in itself. The argument has to be valid, and the premises have to actually be true. That Avengers argument? Well, it's valid. The logic holds. But is it sound? That depends on whether you think premise 1 is true. Does box office gross equal quality? That's where the real debate is. The structure works, but you might reject the foundation. And this distinction, it really matters in philosophy, because in the real world, people make valid arguments with false premises all the time. The logic works, but the foundation, it's rubbish. So you need to check both. Does the logic hold, and are the premises actually true? All right, now hopefully you know what a good argument might look like, even if I've taught it to you by showing you two not so good arguments. Let's talk about where arguments go wrong. And these are called fallacies. They're patterns of bad reasoning that show up constantly in the way people argue. They're kind of like potholes in a busy street. They're easy to spot once you're on the lookout for them, but hard to ignore once you see them, and something you would definitely want to avoid. I'll give you three of the most common fallacies. First, there's the ad hominem fallacy, which is basically attacking the person instead of the argument. It's something like this. You say Avengers Endgame isn't any good, but you couldn't write anything better, so your criticism doesn't count. See what happened there? They didn't address why you think Endgame isn't any good, your actual reasons about pacing or character arcs or whatever. They attacked you and your credentials as a filmmaker. But here's the thing, You don't need to be a chef to know when food tastes bad. And you don't need to be a screenwriter to evaluate whether a film works. Maybe I couldn't write a better screenplay, but that doesn't mean that my argument about screenplays is wrong. You have to engage with the reasons I gave, not just dismiss me because of who I am or what I do. And ad hominem attacks are everywhere. Film debates, politics, online arguments, family dinners, even my mother uses them sometimes. Once you see it, you'll notice it constantly. Second, there's the straw man fallacy, which is misrepresenting someone's position to make it easier to attack. So let's say I argue, well, Endgame had some pacing issues in the second act, but the time heist section, well, that dragged a bit. And you respond, oh, so you're saying the entire MCU is garbage. You think 23 films and a decade worth of storytelling is worthless. That's a straw man argument. You've taken my actual position, a specific criticism about pacing in one section of one film, and twisted it into something way more extreme, and then attacked that instead. It's easier to knock down the you hate the entire MCU argument than engage with what I actually said about the second act. Straw manning is incredibly common in heated debates because it feels like you're winning, but you're not, because you're not engaging with the real argument. You're just shadowboxing. So, fallacy number 3. Here's a fancy little Latin phrase that will impress all of your friends, assuming you've still got some at this point. The post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which means after this, therefore because of this. This is when you assume that because B happened after A must have caused B. It goes something like this. I wore my Avengers t-shirt to the opening night and Endgame became the highest grossing film ever. Therefore my t-shirt caused the box office success. Alright, get it. That's a stupid example, but here's maybe a little bit of a better example. Endgame came out and then Marvel's streaming numbers went up. Therefore, Endgame caused the streaming surge. Maybe. Or maybe Disney Plus had just launched. Or maybe it was the pandemic keeping people home. Or maybe it was the release of WandaVision or a dozen other variables. Correlation isn't causation. You actually need more evidence to establish that causal link. And this fallacy is everywhere, in film analysis, politics, advertising, health fads. Things like Marvel added more humour after Iron Man succeeded, so that must be why the MCU works. Post hoc. Or we got a new CEO and the studio's profits went up. Post hoc. Maybe there's a real connection, but you need to rule out other explanations and provide more evidence first. All right, so we've covered how to spot bad arguments. But here's something most people don't know. There's a move that you can make that actually strengthens your debates and helps you think better. A lot of people call it steel manning these days, and it's the exact opposite of straw manning. Philosophers also know it as the principle of charity, because you're being charitable to somebody's argument and considering the best version of it. So instead of distorting someone's argument to make it weaker, you try to present it in its strongest possible form. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You fill in gaps charitably. You make their case as strong as it can be, and then you engage with it. But why would you do this? Isn't that making it harder for yourself? Yes. Exactly. But here's the thing. If you can defeat the strongest version of an argument, you've actually accomplished something. It means you can defeat any version of that same argument. And if you only beat up on weak versions, then you don't really ever learn anything, and neither has anybody else. Steel manning makes you a better thinker because it forces you to engage with ideas seriously. And it makes conversations more productive because the other person feels heard instead of misrepresented. So try this. The next time you disagree with someone, before you respond, say back to them what it is you think their position is. Something like, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying X because of Y and Z. Is that right? If they say yes, then you engage. And if they say no, you've just avoided arguing with a position that they don't even hold. All of these things are what good philosophers do. We try to take each other's arguments seriously. We try to make them as strong as possible, even if they're not our own arguments. And then we see how our own arguments hold up and how the others do. It's not about winning, mostly. Instead, it's about getting closer to the truth. Now, let's apply all of this to a real-world example. Imagine someone says, we shouldn't take that film critic's review of Endgame seriously. They gave it a bad review, but they're clearly just a DC fanboy trying to trash Marvel. What's going wrong here? Well, first, There's an ad hominem fallacy in there. The speaker is attacking the person, not engaging with their actual criticism. Maybe they do prefer DC films, but that doesn't automatically mean that their arguments about Endgame's pacing, structure, or character choices are wrong. You have to evaluate the reasons they gave, not just dismiss them because of their preferences. Second, let's steelman the concern. Their real worry might be, could their preference for a different style of superhero film create bias that affects how they evaluate this one? That's a legitimate question, but it's different from they like DC, therefore they're wrong about Marvel. Now, the steelman version of this overall argument would be, we should carefully examine whether their criticisms of Endgame reflect genuine storytelling issues or whether they're applying standards that favour a different kind of superhero film. Are they being fair to what Endgame is trying to do? Now, that's an argument you can engage with. Now we're asking substantive questions about bias, critical standards, and what makes for good storytelling. That's much more productive than just dismissing them outright because of which comics they grew up reading. See the difference? All right, here's your challenge for this week. I'm going to call it the argument audit. Pick 3 things you encounter. Maybe it's a news article, a social media debate, a conversation with a friend, and ask yourself, firstly, what's the actual argument being made here? Can you identify the premises and the conclusion? Secondly, ask yourself, is it valid? If the premises were true, would the conclusion follow? And thirdly, ask, is it sound? Are the premises actually true? And the fourth thing you can do is ask, are there any fallacies, like an ad hominem, a straw hand, or a post hoc? And then here's the hard last thing you should do. Can you steelman the opposing view? Can you state it better than the person who's making it? I promise you, do it 3 times this week, just a quick little go. You'll be shocked how quickly you start seeing patterns and how much clearer your own thinking becomes. And here's why that steelmanning exercise matters so much. Because it forces you to play what's called devil's advocate. It forces you to really inhabit an opposing argument charitably and from the inside out. And that's critical to being a philosopher. You have to understand the strongest version of a position to know its real problems and to disagree with it properly. But here's the thing. If you walk a mile or 2 in that argument's shoes and you don't actually find anything wrong with it, you might discover something important. You might realise that you should change your mind, or that there is a piece in that good argument that is good, that gets you closer to the truth, and that you can actually take away and use yourself. And doing that consciously, based on good reasons and arguments, rather than ego or stubbornness, that's not weakness. That's exactly what philosophy is supposed to do. It's just good thinking. So, here's what I want you to think about at the end of all this. Now that you know what good reasoning looks like, what happens when you apply it to the biggest questions? Questions like, do you actually have free will? How do you know anything is real? What makes something right or wrong? Because that's where we're headed next. We built the toolkit. Now we're going to use it. So next time, we'll talk about, does free will exist? Or is every choice you've made in your life just physics playing out exactly as it had to? Let me know in the comments. Have you spotted any of the fallacies that we discussed in the wild this week? And if you want to keep sharpening your thinking with me, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find their way to better thinking too, and it might just make your life a little easier online. So be wise, be kind, and I'll see you next time.